Our gospel lesson and sermon text is John chapter 18, verses 12 through 27. So the soldiers, their officer, and the Jewish police arrested Jesus and bound him. First, they took him to Annas, who is the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jewish temple leaders that it was better to have one person die for the people. Simon Peter and another disciple followed Jesus. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter was standing outside the gate. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out, spoke to the woman who guarded the gate, and brought Peter in. The woman said to Peter, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the slaves and the police had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing around it and warming themselves. Peter also was standing with them and warming himself. Then the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Jesus answered, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who heard what I said to them. They know what I said." When he had said this, one of the police standing nearby struck Jesus on the face, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered, "If I have spoken wrongly, testify to the wrong. But if I have spoken rightly, why do you strike me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. They asked him, "You are not also one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Again, Peter denied it. And at that moment, the cock crowed. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. We don't usually read this story on Sunday morning. In most lectionaries, it happens on Maundy, Thursday, or perhaps a Tenebrae service when it's nighttime, when the lights in the sanctuary are dimmed. And I think that there's a part of us that would rather not listen at all. And there's a part of us that would rather look away. It's painful to watch Peter denying Jesus. And when the rooster crows, it pierces us to our core. All four gospel writers tell this story. All four gospel writers have Jesus warning Peter that before the rooster crows, Peter will have denied him 3 times. And all four gospel writers have Peter emphatically denying that he would ever be a disciple of Jesus, which makes it all the more heart-wrenching when he does betray Jesus and deny. And it's not just the voyeurism of watching Peter on the worst night of his life that bothers us. It's also the recognition of something of ourselves in Peter. It's the realization that we too have failed to keep promises. It's one thing for a politician to say, "Read my lips, no new taxes," and then go back on that pledge. But it's quite another for you or I to realize that we have failed to keep promises to the very ones we love the most. We can think of friendships that died because one friend failed to live up to his or her word. And how many parents are brave enough to ask whether they have kept all of their promises to their children? In the gospel writer Luke's version of the story, at the moment of Peter's third denial, the rooster crows, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." And Peter went out and wept bitterly. Can you imagine that look? Do you remember anyone ever looking at you like that? It's a look that doesn't need words. It's a look that says, Peter, now you know, and you know that I know what you did. It's a look that strips away the covers from the various defenses that you and I use with greater and lesser success to deceive ourselves into thinking what nice people we are. Perhaps there was someone in your life who had that certain look. They could simply look at you in a certain way and convey the purest essence of disappointed love. Peter has sworn and denied ever knowing Jesus, and then Jesus looks at him. The Gospel of John tells this story a little differently from the other three Gospels. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Peter denies knowing Jesus. But in John, Peter denies being Jesus' disciple. That might seem like a subtle distinction, but in John's account, Peter isn't simply denying that he knows Jesus. He is denying something about himself. He is denying his own identity as a disciple of Christ. As Peter stands out over a charcoal fire, desperately trying to warm himself, he doesn't know who he is anymore. Just a scene earlier, Peter had drawn a sword and was ready to fight the Roman soldiers and others who had come to arrest Jesus. Peter had swung his sword and slashed off the ear of the high priest's slave. Now, why was it that Peter was brave enough to fight the Roman soldiers who had come to arrest Jesus, but apparently not brave enough to admit that he was a disciple while everyone was standing there warming themselves over the fire? Maybe it's because instinctual violence is somehow easier than testimony. It's just easier for Peter to swing his sword than it is for him to admit to being a disciple. That might be it, but I suspect that there's another reason. Perhaps it was because Peter himself was heartbroken. According to Brené Brown, heartbreak is what happens when love is lost, or when there is a perceived loss of love. It's not just disappointment. It's the realization or the fear that love is gone, that it's lost. After all, Peter was ready to defend Jesus with a sword. You can't say that he wasn't brave. Peter was definitely brave. But what happened next was that Jesus told Peter to put away the sword, and then Jesus was immediately taken into custody. And for Peter, that must have been a heartbreaking moment. For Peter, the teacher that he loved and adored, had just allowed himself to be captured, with the end result that the teacher would most likely be put to death. How heartbreaking to give up without a fight. It's a heartbreaking loss of love, because the teacher that Peter loved is about to die. Can you imagine what would have happened to the Ukrainian people if President Zelensky had fled to Poland early on, or if he had waved the white flag of surrender? It would have been heartbreaking. It would have been devastating for the Ukrainian troops, and perhaps many of the Ukrainian cities, the people in the Ukrainian cities would have lost their own will to resist when the invaders came. But instead, Zelensky's resolve to keep fighting has inspired the free world. If we try to imagine how the Ukrainian people might have felt if Zelensky had surrendered quickly, then we can begin to understand the heartbreak and grief experienced by the disciples the moment that Jesus allowed himself to be captured. Perhaps Peter denied being a disciple of Jesus because he didn't know what it would mean to be a disciple of a leader who gave up. Heartbreak leads to more heartbreak. And when Peter denies that he is Jesus' disciple, it is Jesus' heart that gets broken. For many of us, there is a charcoal fire somewhere in our lives. We have stood over that fire, desperately trying to warm ourselves, and wishing even more desperately that we could undo what we did. The hard truth is that we cannot undo it. But the hope is that we can experience forgiveness and restoration. At the very heart of family life lies the need for forgiveness. Our families, whether families of origin or families of choice or even our church family, are crucibles in which failure and sin must be worked out. in our nuclear families. Family life can only be healthy when spouses or partners seek one another's forgiveness, when parents forgive children, and parents model forgiveness so that children will learn how to do it. For the time will inevitably come when our children must forgive us. Forgiveness is not cheap. It is not easy. It always costs the forgiver. It cost Jesus everything. And the look that Jesus gave to Peter was not just a look of pure judgment. It wasn't simply the look of heartbreak or the look of deeply disappointed love. It was also a look, ultimately, of reconciling love. In John's version of the story, there is another charcoal fire. This is in chapter 21 of the Gospel of John. This is after Jesus' resurrection. Peter decides to go fishing, perhaps because he's not certain what else he can do. But all through the night, Peter and the other disciples fail to catch any fish. And then a stranger on the shore calls out to them and tells them to cast their nets on the other side. And then they catch more fish than they can handle. The moment that Peter realizes that the stranger on the shore is really the Lord, Peter jumps off the boat and swims to the shore. When he gets there, Jesus is already cooking some fish over the fire. 3 different times, Jesus asks Peter if he loves him. And 3 different times, Peter says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." 3 affirmations of love that now take the place of 3 denials. And in place of that haunting memory of the old charcoal fire, there is now the memory of this new one, a charcoal fire from which Jesus prepares the very sustenance that Peter and the disciples need. It may be that you have recently experienced forgiveness and reconciliation, that you have experienced some measure of healing for your own broken heart. Or it might be that the forgiveness you have sought has not yet come, or that the forgiveness that others seek from you is not easily given because the wounds are too deep. And the last thing you need is to hear from some well-meaning person about how Christians are supposed to forgive and forget. This is no place for bumper sticker theology. Forgiveness cannot be rushed, and most of the time should not be rushed. And it may be that we need to spend the entire sleepless night on the boat first, or that happens to us at any rate. But what I believe by faith is that one day we will hear the voice of the stranger telling us where to cast our net, and once we've caught our haul of fish, inviting us to have breakfast on the lake shore. And as we gather around that charcoal fire, the stranger will feed us with bread and some fish, and will finally, at long last, heal our broken hearts. All glory and praise be to our God. Amen.